The openings of novels hold a special status for the reader because so much orienting information can be found there. Openings have a certain kind of work to do compared, say, to the unfolding narrative which follows it, and the end of the novel, which closes down the fictional world and returns the reader to the real one. These preludes, or overtures, often have a self-conscious element to them as well. That is, they seem at times to be aware of someone reading them, or beginning an act of reading that requires a person to put aside their regular consciousness of the living world around them in order to replace that world with a fully realized artificial one. It's not unusual, then, to find acts of reading represented in the opening pages of a novel such as The Awakening, where indeed we meet a man reading a newspaper, or trying to at least. The novel opens by gesturing towards this and other kinds of reading, listening, watching, piecing things together, all at the same moment our eyes meet the page. When our eyes do meet that first page in this particular novel, they're struck with a vivid set of images and sounds that are finely detailed. They come at us one after another in discrete units, like a list of facts in a legal deposition. And while we can't possibly know what they mean right away, their vividness and precision take on an immediate, subliminal, almost archetypal symbolic import. The intense compactness of Kate Chopin's writing style, lush at the same time spare and succinct, tells us all we need to know. It's also a rather strange, uninviting way to open a novel by having a loud bird scream in French, go away, for heaven's sake." Here's the way the book opens, and it's worth mulling over some of its details. A green and yellow parrot, which hung in a cage outside the door, kept repeating over and over, "Allez-vous-en, allez-vous-en, sapristi, that's all right." He could speak a little Spanish and also a language which nobody understood unless it was the mockingbird that hung on the other side of the door, whistling his fluty notes out upon the breeze with maddening persistence. Mr. Pontellier, unable to read his newspaper with any degree of comfort, arose with an expression and an exclamation of disgust. He walked down the gallery and across the narrow bridges which connected the Lebrun cottages one with the other. He had been seated before the door of the main house. The parrot and the mockingbird were the property of Madame Lebrun, and they had the right to make all the noise they wished. Mr. Pontellier had the privilege of quitting their society when they ceased to be entertaining. Even before we meet a human being, we meet another bird, this time a mockingbird, that can only imitate the other bird songs it hears without being able to produce its own utterance. Both of these birds hang captive in cages where their natural lives are taken away from them in order to become pets, ornaments, and playthings for those who have so comfortably imprisoned them. We'll see other birds throughout the book. They appear, for instance, in Edna's dreams with broken wings. They become associated with Edna herself, who, in her most audacious action in the novel, moves out of her home and into the much smaller pigeon house to be away from her husband and children. At another key moment, Mademoiselle Reisz refers to Edna's shoulder blades as the wings of a bird, as she conveys to Edna the idea that being a true artist takes a great deal of courage. So another thing we can take away from these images of caged birds is a concise assessment of Edna's predicament, especially that aspect of it that has to do with the aspiring artist, the one who makes music or who is vividly colorful, who produces a kind of pleasure that becomes cloying or aggravating to those who would try to contain it. The chattering birds interrupt the serious business of reading a newspaper. If we take this a step further and say that putting birds in cages is a human thing to do in the name of having beauty and pleasure at one's disposal, then what do we make of the way in which creating such a captive entertainer can also gall and annoy the supposed target of that pleasure? Taken from nature to be domesticated and trained for a subordinate role in the hierarchy of a male dominated society, women are like these caged birds. But just as we're about to embrace this rather heavy handed metaphor Chopin seems to offer us, we learn that these domesticated birds belong to a woman, Madame Lebrun. Moreover, Madame Lebrun, as we come to know her, is anything but a mere ornament. A widow, she not only owns the cottages that accommodate her upper middle class guests from the mainland, but she manages the whole business with skill and she keeps a firm hold on her sons. The birds are her property, and with this one important fact, a complexity arises. The novel, centered on Edna, deliberately avoids the expected justifications for her restless feeling of constraint or pain or economic want. The book, in fact, places its central female character within a small constellation of other kinds of women who seem accomplished, contented, and self knowing. Even the portrait of Edna's husband, Leonce, is more positive than we might expect. He's well liked, a good provider, a kind father to his children, and yet something's not quite right with this picture. If the maddening persistence of the parrot's go away, sends Leonce away, to whom can we attribute that command? Reading further into the novel, we might look back on its opening page to conclude that this foreshadows Edna's refrain to her husband when she seeks solitude from his presence. But again, it's not so simple, because the birds in the cages are males, which we learn when the narrator refers to the parrot as he. Finally, we want to keep another detail in mind as well. Given the parrot's ability to mimic three different languages, the narrator quietly slips in that he also speaks a language nobody understood. The nobody is interesting to contemplate. Does it mean specifically the hotel guests, Leonce, or Edna herself? Maybe the book itself, Chopin's text, counterposes itself against this failure of communication in what it has to tell us about Edna and women like her. Kate Chopin was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1850, one of five children born to an Irish immigrant named Thomas O'Flaherty and his much younger wife, Eliza Charleville. A Southern family of means, the O'Flahertys owned slaves in the years before the American Civil War. Two of her sisters died as babies, and at the age of 5, Kate was sent to a Catholic boarding school called the Sacred Heart Academy, where she excelled as a student. 2 months after she left home, her father, who was among the civic leaders of the St. Louis community, was traveling by train over the newly built Gasconade Bridge when it collapsed and killed him. 29 other passengers were also killed on their way from St. Louis to Jefferson City. Some of you may be familiar with the very short story Kate Chopin wrote many years later called The Story of an Hour, which is only a few paragraphs long. In it, a woman receives the news that her husband has been killed in a train accident. She reacts the way we might expect to this shocking event, crying and grieving over her husband's untimely death until gradually she retreats to her bedroom and begins to experience a newfound feeling of freedom. As she emerges from her grief and begins to relish these new feelings, she hears something in the entranceway below. Her husband has walked into the house, very much alive. The report of the train wreck turns out to have been misreported. When all of this becomes clear, the woman suffers a heart attack and dies. The last line of the story reads, "When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills." In 1870, Kate O'Flaherty met and married Oscar Chopin in St. Louis. En route to New York to sail for Europe on her honeymoon, the couple visited Philadelphia, where they met on the train a pair of sisters, Tennessee Claflin and Victoria Woodhull, who were stockbrokers, journalists, and women's rights advocates. In her diary, Kate Chopin reports that we had the honor and pleasure of making acquaintance of Miss Claflin, the notorious female broker of New York, a fussy, pretty, talkative little woman who discussed business extensively with Oscar and entreated me not to fall into the useless, degrading life of most married ladies, but to elevate my mind and turn my attention to politics, commerce, questions of state, etc., etc. I assured her I would do so, which assurance satisfied her quite. When the Chopins returned to America from Europe, the couple settled into a cottage at 443 Magazine Street in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. 2 months after they returned, Oscar's father died. Dr. Victor Jean-Baptiste Chopin, a wealthy and brutal plantation owner, had emigrated from France to settle in Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana. Oscar began his career as a cotton factor in 1871, a job in which he prospered until a yellow fever epidemic struck New Orleans in 1878, incurring substantial financial losses and much debt after a poor cotton harvest. Up to this time, the Chopins spent each summer on Grand Isle, a popular resort for Creoles 50 miles to the south of New Orleans. To economize, Oscar Chopin moved his family to Natchitoches Parish, where his father had owned land. There he opened a general store in the town of Cloutierville, where both Oscar and Kate had relatives. Kate Chopin was, from her earliest years, a voracious reader. When she completed her formal education, she returned home to St. Louis to live with her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother, who taught her French, instructed her in music, trained her to think logically, and filled her imagination with scandalous stories of New Orleans society. This was a woman who, incidentally, had a mother who had obtained the first legal divorce in colonial St. Louis after giving birth to 5 children. Kate's best friend from the Sacred Heart Academy was the daughter of a Confederate sympathizer during the Civil War, and that family was unceremoniously forced from their home in the predominantly pro-Union community of St. Louis. This happened the same year Kate's great-grandmother died, the first of what would be a number of losses. One of Kate's brothers died of typhus fever fighting on the Confederate side of the war, and none of her other siblings were to live past the age of 25. Kate and her new husband Oscar were well suited to each other. They were both liberal-minded and somewhat cynical about conventional manners and mores. On their honeymoon, Kate tried smoking cigarettes for the first time, and would continue in this habit for the rest of her adult life. She walked the city streets unaccompanied, drank beer, played cards, learned to row a boat, and disregarded the injunction placed on women of her class to avoid the sun by not wearing a hat when she went out. She gave up going to Mass with any consistency, and by the age of 28, she had given birth to 5 sons. Later, she had a daughter. Oscar Chopin was not good at running a cotton plantation or a general store. In 1882, he contracted yellow fever and died suddenly, putting his wife in the situation of running both for the entirety of 1 year. She inherited debts totaling $12,000 and had a discreet affair with a wealthy, handsome married planter named Albert Sampite, a Confederate veteran fond of hunting, drinking, and gambling. Having moved back to St. Louis to be with her mother, Chopin began to write sketches of Creole characters she had known and began to contemplate a career as a professional writer to make money. She read French fiction, coming under the sway especially of the short story writer Guy de Maupassant, of whose fiction Chopin wrote in 1896, "I read his stories and marvel at them. Here was life, not fiction. For where were the plots, the old-fashioned mechanism and stage trapping that in a vague, unthinking way I had fancied were essential to the art of story-making? Here was a man who had escaped from tradition and authority, who had entered into himself and looked out upon life through his own being and with his own eyes, and who, in a direct and simple way, told us what he saw." The death of her mother shortly after Kate's move to St. Louis made the idea of publication all the more urgent. Her first published story, called Wiser Than a God, tells of a woman who becomes a great artistic success, but only after her mother's death. Chopin's stories began to appear in magazines like The Century, Youth's Companion, and The Atlantic. Her diary reveals a great admiration for other female writers of her time, including Sarah Orne Jewett and Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Her first collection of stories was published in 1894 by Houghton Mifflin under the title Bayou Folk, and received favorable reviews in the national press. The stories paint a vivid picture of New Orleans and its Creole population and French descendants. Tales like Désirée's Baby, Madame Celestine's Divorce, and Love on the Bon Dieu satisfied readers' tastes for local realism and a glimpse into the exotic ways of life in distinctive communities throughout the United States. A second short story collection, also well received, began to establish Chopin as a sharp-eyed observer and elegant stylist. A Night in Acadie appeared in 1897, the same year Chopin was writing a draft of a novel under the working title A Solitary Soul. In 1899, she published that book under a new title, called The Awakening, to a storm of negative reviews. The novel was not actually banned, and several reviewers did praise it, but the overwhelmingly male community of the literary establishment effectively refused to publish her forthcoming collection of stories after The Awakening appeared and put an end to her career as a novelist. The collection of stories that was declined has since been published in a modern edition entitled A Vocation and a Voice. By the turn of the 20th century, Kate Chopin's health began to fail. In 1904, after a full day of touring the vast fairgrounds of the St. Louis Exposition, she suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died a few days later at the age of 54. In the decades that followed, Chopin's work slipped from view, and her literary accomplishments largely unrecognized or forgotten. In the 1920s, some of Kate Chopin's short fiction began to resurface in literary anthologies, and by the next decade, a biography was published that spoke admiringly about her stories, but dismissed her novel, The Awakening, as an unfortunate mistake in the writer's career. It was only in the 1950s that scholars began to reconsider The Awakening as an accomplished novel with important things to say, and this led to a modest revival of interest in her writing. By the early 1970s, a scholar named Per Seyerstedt published a new account of her life and literary output that was far more sympathetic to The Awakening. He simultaneously began to reissue her complete works, making them widely available to a first wave of feminist critics who did a lot of work securing Chopin's place in the canon of American literature. Since that time, The Awakening has never gone out of print and has been translated into over a dozen languages, including Dutch, German, Spanish, and Chinese. In 1986, the American novelist Robert Stone published a book called Children of Light, a fictional account of a screenwriter who is working on a film adaptation of Chopin's The Awakening. The modern version of the book's main character, Edna Pontellier, is a fading and deeply troubled actress named Leanne Verger, who suffers from alcoholism and schizophrenia. She's assigned the role of Edna in the film. When we first meet Leanne, she has just lost custody of her child in a harrowing divorce from her husband. In seeking to play the role of Edna Pontellier, Leanne hopes to redeem her personal life and revive her film career, but she can neither beat her addiction nor escape from her psychological disorder. She eventually suffers hallucinations on the movie set and finally dies at the end of the novel. Given the centrality of Chopin's novel to the study of American literature, it's difficult to imagine how vehemently its first readers reacted to it. It's instructive to get some general idea of what these harsh criticisms were so fixated upon. In the spring of 1899, for instance, a reviewer from the St. Louis Mirror, the city where Chopin was born some 40 years earlier, began this way: because we admire Kate Chopin's other work immensely and delight in her ever-growing fame and are proud that she is one of us St. Louisans, one dislikes to acknowledge a wish that she had not written her novel. The review continues. It is not a pleasant picture of soul dissection, take it any way you like. And so, though she finally kills herself, or rather lets herself drown to death, one feels that it is not in the desperation born of an overburdened heart, torn by complicating duties, but rather because she realizes that something is due to her children, that she cannot get away from, and she is too weak to face the issue. Besides which, and this is the stronger feeling, she has offered herself wholly to the man who loves her too well to take her at her word. She realizes that the day would come when he too and the thought of him would melt out of her existence. She has awakened to know the shifting, treacherous, fickle deeps of her own soul, in which lies, alert and strong and cruel, the fiend called passion that is all animal and all of the earth earthy. It is better to lie down in the green waves and sink down in close embraces of old ocean, and so she does. There's no fault to find in the telling of the story. There are no blemishes in its art, but it leaves one sick of human nature, and so one feels cui bono, for whose benefit. From another St. Louis paper. The Awakening is not a healthy book. If it points any particular moral or teaches any lesson, the fact is not apparent. But there is no denying the fact that it deals with existent conditions and without attempting solution handles a problem that obtrudes itself only too frequently in the social life of people with whom the question of food and clothing is not the all-absorbing one. Mrs. Pontellier does not love her husband. The poison of passion seems to have entered her system with her mother's milk. That she is violently in love with Robert Lebrun is made very apparent to the reader in the first chapter, though she does not seem to realize the fact herself. She is all heart and entirely without balance. Naturally, she lets her love for the young man, who also loves her, make her miserable. This is at a summer boarding house in Louisiana, and much of the story is brought out while a lot of people are bathing, or on the way to the beach, or returning in the moonlight. After reading the book, it cannot be said that either of the principal characters claims admiration or sympathy. It is a morbid book. To understand where these attitudes about women come from, we have to reconstruct the broader discourse about sex and gender roles in the mid to late 19th century. Furthermore, we can extend the idea of discourse beyond language to include other representations of middle-class, educated women of the time. Painting is one such example. This is important because writers like Chopin were immersed in such representational and discursive contexts, and their literary representations cannot fully be grasped without reference to the very materials made available to them as creative artists. Only by looking at the dominant culture's modes of female representation can we gauge the subversive achievement of a writer like Kate Chopin. Beginning at the top, as it were, let's begin with a way of speaking and thinking about middle class white American women that was being disseminated from the highest governmental ranks. The national discourse, we'll say, coming from the most charismatic political leader of the time and its most progressive, President Theodore Roosevelt. In a 1905 speech that he delivered to the National Congress of Mothers, Roosevelt said the following: "But the nation is in a bad way if there is no real home, if the family is not of the right kind, if the man is not a good husband and father, if he is brutal or cowardly or selfish, if the woman has lost her sense of duty, if she is sunk in vapid self-indulgence or has let her nature be twisted so that she prefers a sterile pseudo-intellectuality to that great and beautiful development of character which comes only to those whose lives know the fullness of duty done, or effort made and self-sacrifice undergone." He continues, "In the last analysis, the welfare of the state depends absolutely upon whether or not the average family, the average man and woman and their children, represent the kind of citizenship fit for the foundation of a great nation. And if we fail to appreciate this, we fail to appreciate the root morality upon which all healthy civilization is based. No piled up wealth, no splendor of material growth, no brilliance of artistic development will permanently avail any people unless its home life is healthy, unless the average man possesses honesty, courage, common sense, and decency, unless he works hard and is willing at need to fight hard, and unless the average woman is a good wife, a good mother, able and willing to perform the first and greatest duty of womanhood, able and willing to bear and to bring up as they should be brought up, healthy children, sound in body, mind, and character, and numerous enough so that the race shall increase and not decrease." Roosevelt's attack on a certain kind of woman continues in the following: "The existence of women of this type, who forego bearing children, forms one of the most unpleasant and unwholesome features of modern life. That it also exists in American life is made unpleasantly evident in equally sinister fashion by the census statistics as to divorce, which are fairly appalling. For easy divorce is now, as it ever has been, a bane to any nation, a curse to society, a menace to the home, an incitement to married unhappiness and to immorality, an evil thing for men, and a still more hideous evil for women. These unpleasant tendencies in our American life are made evident by articles such as those which I actually read not long ago in a certain paper where a clergyman was quoted, seemingly with approval, as expressing the general American attitude when he said that the ambition of any save a very rich man should be to rear 2 children only, so as to give his children an opportunity to taste a few of the good things of life."
Unhampered by tradition, uncorrupted by power, undismayed by the magnitude of the task, the new party offers itself as the instrument of the people to sweep away old abuses, to build a new and nobler commonwealth.
Although Roosevelt was a progressive and advocated for women's rights a few years later, the first thing you notice in his speech to mothers is his emphasis on the home and duty, that domestic sphere to which women are confined and for which they are responsible. These responsibilities, of course, include having children and raising them properly, making a comfortable home for her husband, and generally supervising the moral development of the entire household. But the language Roosevelt uses to describe a woman's pursuit of knowledge and ideas is dripping with contempt and places stress on the damaging effects on female procreation that a life of the mind will inevitably lead to. A sterile pseudo-intellectuality is the kind of sexist put-down one might hear applied to the accomplished pair of sisters Kate Chopin was so impressed with as a young bride on the train. Any evidence of self-care that went outside the acceptable bounds of child-rearing or indications of bodily pleasure or sexual desire beyond her wifely duties is construed by Roosevelt as vapid self-indulgence and twisted. Because such assumptions were widely accepted at the close of the 19th century, Chopin would have experienced their negative effects firsthand without having to hear these ideas expressed so bombastically by the President of the United States. But to have these explicit pronouncements concerning the proper responsibilities of a wife and mother before us, we need to scrutinize the feelings and attitudes that may arise for some readers of the Awakening. On the most obvious level, Edna's relationship to her children is caring on the one hand and blatantly detached on the other. In pursuing her exploration of self-identity, she leaves her children for others to tend, her husband, her mother-in-law, her nanny, for example. And maybe the most telling thing in the book is her death itself. Whether she has planned her own drowning or miscalculated her strength as a swimmer, Edna's action leaves her children orphaned of their mother. So where do her responsibilities lie? To whom or what is she responsible? Although, to his credit, Roosevelt did support equal rights for women in the areas of education, the law, and the vote, he nevertheless condemns easy divorce and advocates an increase in the population of white Americans to counteract both declining birth rates in this group and the growing numbers of children born to non-native immigrants to the country. The family is to him the foundational microcosm of national identity and a replication of the patriarchal hierarchy of power. In The Awakening, we find the language of female subjugation in the sentiments expressed by Edna's husband Leonce, who echoes the biopolitics of Roosevelt. He reproached his wife with her inattention, her habitual neglect of the children. If it was not a mother's place to look after children, whose on earth was it? He himself had his hands full with his brokerage business. He could not be in two places at once, making a living for his family on the street and staying at home to see that no harm befell them. He talked in a monotonous, insistent way. There is something revealing in the narrator's tone in that last phrase, which undercuts how seriously we are to take Leonce's opinions. It should also be pointed out that these ideas are not limited to men like Leonce. Women like Madame Ratignolle has so fully internalized this way of thinking that even she reinforces the same procreative imperatives to her friend Edna. But even though Leonce appears to believe unquestioningly in what he says to his wife, note the way Chopin's narrator recasts his ideas at the beginning of the next chapter. It would have been a difficult matter for Mr. Pontellier to define to his own satisfaction or anyone else's wherein his wife failed in her duty toward their children. It was something which he felt rather than perceived, and he never voiced the feeling without subsequent regret and ample atonement. The important words in this qualification of Leonce's position have to do with his inability to define Edna's supposed failure with any precision, whereas the dominant discourse of female duty has a definitive quality that reinforces its simulation of an essential truth. Here, Chopin questions Leonce's certainty by reducing his beliefs to a feeling that falls just short of articulation. Chopin appropriates the available dominant discourse almost word for word, but inserts it into a context in which the perspective has been reversed and the tone altered. The literary text dilutes, undercuts the power of such utterances, producing something new. Taking this powerful effect to an even more intense level, Chopin begins to shift the perspective even more dramatically by giving the reader sudden access to Edna's own thoughts and voice. She had all her life long been accustomed to harbor thoughts and emotions which never voiced themselves. They had never taken the form of struggles. They belonged to her and were her own, and she entertained the conviction that she had a right to them, and that they concerned no one but herself. Edna had once told Madame Ratignolle that she would never sacrifice herself for her children, or for anyone. As Edna's suppressed feelings rise to the level of articulation, they are made to do so as Leonce's articulation of a mother's duties devolve into a vague feeling. As if to compound her intensifying critique of motherhood, Chopin leads Edna into a graphic confrontation with the brutal physical realities of childbirth in the scene in which Madame Ratignolle's oncoming labor stirs Edna's memories of her own experience. She was seized with a vague dread. Her own like experiences seemed far away, unreal, and only half remembered. She recalled faintly an ecstasy of pain, the heavy odor of chloroform, a stupor which had deadened sensation, and an awakening to find a little new life to which she had given being, added to the great unnumbered multitude of souls that come and go. She began to wish she had not come. Her presence was not necessary. She might have invented a pretext for staying away. She might even invent a pretext now for going. But Edna did not go. With an inward agony, with a flaming, outspoken revolt against the ways of nature, she witnessed the scene of torture. Chopin is also aware of another powerful component of female subjugation that was aligned with patriarchal forms of control, namely medicine and the clinical diagnosis of feminine disorders. When Leonce becomes frustrated by Edna's recalcitrance, he consults Dr. Mandelet and invites him to dinner to examine his wife casually. Dr. Mandelet's first question to Leonce is whether Edna has been associating with pseudo-intellectual women, which would be one possible source, in his view, of the irregularity in Edna's feminine makeup. But again, Chopin both acknowledges this prejudice against women at the same time she includes a character who is in fact a young woman with intellectual interests, the daughter of Mrs. Highcamp, who attends lectures. This younger generation of women are more than happy to pursue the development of their own minds rather than follow a conventional path to marriage and motherhood. It's instructive to look at the various kinds of women in the novel and the way Chopin represents them. The consummate mother woman, of course, is Adele Ratignolle, whose pregnancy, delicacy, and solicitous attention to her husband and children make her a contrast and object of tension for Edna. The first description we have of her is revealing. There are no words to describe her save the old ones that have served so often to picture the bygone heroine of romance and the fair lady of our dreams. There was nothing subtle or hidden about her charms. Her beauty was all there, flaming and apparent. The spun gold hair, that comb nor confining pin could restrain, the blue eyes that were like nothing but sapphires, two lips that pouted, that were so red one could only think of cherries or some other delicious crimson fruit in looking at them. She was growing a little stout, but it did not seem to detract an iota from the grace of every step, pose, gesture. One would not have wanted her white neck a mite less full or her beautiful arms more slender. Never were hands more exquisite than hers, and it was a joy to look at them when she threaded her needle or adjusted her gold thimble to her taper middle finger as she sewed away on the little night drawers or fashioned a bodice or a bib. Only the old words from a bygone era of romance will suffice, as if this kind of heroine were a throwback that this work of literary realism has no fresh language to describe. Madame Ratignolle's eyes are like sapphires, precious stones connoting wealth and value as ornaments. Her lips are edible, consumable as cherries or some other crimson fruit. Every step, pose, gesture is struck gracefully as if her fragile beauty required great care. There is nothing deep about her charms, suggesting a vacant inner life, a thing of surfaces meant for the giving of comfort or pleasure. And finally, there is the detail about what her hands are busy with, sewing clothing for her children and fashioning clever garments to cover and accentuate her bosom. When contrasted with what Edna's hands do and what she expends her bodily energy doing, we begin to see how Chopin correlates her dawning consciousness of self with a gradual improvement in her drawing and painting, an activity that shifts the tools and control over representation from men to her own hands. It seems no mistake that the one figure she struggles to draw but can't is Adele Ratignolle. Learning to swim is also a sign of Edna's need for mastery over forces stronger than she is. To remain on the surface of great depths is both a skill and a physical challenge that joins her mind and body in ways that seem unique and unusual in her social group. She also tells the best story in competition with the men in her company. Of course, the far end of this continuum is Mademoiselle Reisz, the brilliant pianist and artist whose physical appearance comes close to that of a witch. Unliked, alone, unmarried, and poor, she nevertheless occupies a special place in the novel, both with regard to providing an example of the artist's life for Edna, and for being a part of Chopin's constellation of female lives in all their variety. Within this constellation, Edna wonders where she belongs. At the opening of chapter 27, she says, "One of these days I'm going to pull myself together for a while and think, try to determine what character of a woman I am, for candidly I don't know. By all the codes which I am acquainted with, I am a devilishly wicked specimen of the sex, but some way I can't convince myself that I am. I must think about it." Edna speaks these words to Alcée Arobin, the man with whom she is having an affair. You'll notice that he responds by telling her what she is, and her reaction to that is worth noting. She seems to have anticipated the category he wants to put her in, that of an object of male desire, to which she says, "Oh yes, you will tell me that I am adorable, everything that is captivating, spare yourself the effort." In other words, she has already concluded that there are more ways to be a woman, even though they are vague and elusive, but thinking beyond the conventional is always a journey into the unknown. What's important here is that she is kindly dismissing Arobin's attempt to provide her with a role, and this verbal rejection affects her behavior with regard to his seduction. Instead of enjoying her sexual affair with Arobin, she finds it less satisfying than her imagined love for Robert Lebrun. But when she has the opportunity to be alone with Robert, he insists he wants to make her his wife, impose the same confining limits on her that she has just tried to escape from with her husband. The fact that the two outlets for Etna's repressed desires are represented by men is unacceptable, and as a result, it moves this novel outside a typical novel of adultery. Adultery is not the point, but it's the element early critics of the novel saw instead of what we might see. The failure of the sexual affair with Arobin is foretold the moment they are together alone, And it's important to notice how concerted an effort at seduction Arobin pursues. Edna is largely passive about it. In any case, the most intimate moment of touch in their relationship involves Edna tracing her finger along a scar on Arobin's wrist, which repulses her at the same time it compels her to touch it. She responds by clasping his hand so tightly that her nails nearly penetrate his skin. The scar is the trace of an open wound, which is itself suggestive of female genitalia. The tracing of a probing finger across that closed wound is a phallic image, and the action as a whole is a kind of symbolic pantomime of intercourse. The roles here, though, are reversed. The symbolic meaning of the act of penetration, which is about control over a woman's body by an overpowering male, is boldly turned around in this fantasy of female penetration of the male. So while Edna's thoughts and words cannot articulate who she is, her actions in the text speak for her, and perhaps for all women. The novelist's art makes possible in the imagination what may lurk under the veneer of culture, or what may be impossible to say in social reality. Edna, remember, is originally from Kentucky. She's the second daughter of a strict Presbyterian. As a young woman, she's prone to self containment and entertains a number of fantasies about men, including a cavalry officer and a famous stage actor, whose image she keeps in her room and kisses occasionally. She marries a Catholic with a Creole background, mainly to provoke the disapproval of her father and sister, and in doing so, she is introduced into a very different society with very different mores and physical habits. This is why the setting of the novel matters with regard to the changes and developments that alter Edna's character and initiate her awakening. She's a stranger among the Creoles. The process of Edna's sensual and sexual awakening might be understood in part at least as a response to her attraction to otherness that is simultaneously an awareness of herself as other. The physical closeness and lack of inhibition among Creole women offer Edna a contrast to her own sense of embodiment that will eventually exceed in its sheer pleasure even that of the Creoles. Becoming, in a sense, a stranger to herself is one of the preconditions of Edna's ability to evolve as an individual and as a woman. The craving for the exotic, the forbidden, the transgressive is a symptom and a result of her resistance to predetermined roles. Here, then, the setting on Grand Isle is crucial because it is a fully realized world in which to observe the influences that catalyze Edna's awakening. Grand Isle is a beach resort with all the relaxed protocols that differentiate it from the manner of dress, the social schedule, and the ordered home life of the city of New Orleans, where the Pontelliers live. The topography of the region features the delta's interlacing of land and sea, solid ground, and fluidity. You'll note that New Orleans is not just built on the coastline of the Gulf of Mexico, but that an enormous lake, Lake Pontchartrain, is located on the northwest quadrant of the city. This is what makes the city so vulnerable to powerful hurricanes and the flooding they bring. While the time frame of this novel corresponds to a contemporary moment close to the book's date of publication in 1899, we know the events depicted in it could not have taken place after 1893, because one such hurricane ripped through Grand Isle in that year, destroying the majority of its structures. New Orleans has a long and complex history of settlement by the French, the Spanish, Caribbean, and of course a large slave population of Africans. Intermarriage over the centuries, as well as a large infusion of white Americans following the Louisiana Purchase in 1815, created an intricate social and racial hierarchy that nearly approximated a caste system. Creoles are people descended from the original French and Spanish settlers of Louisiana, the very name of the region taken, of course, from King Louis of France. By the late 1800s, Creoles had secured their status as aristocrats in the area. They were Catholic in religion and European in their manners and sensibilities. You'll note, for example, that Madame Lebrun owns a copy of a French novel by one of the Goncourt brothers that she lends to Edna to read. Goncourt was a well-known naturalist writer in the mold of the French master of naturalist fiction Émile Zola, whose 20-volume fictional history of the Rougon-Macquart family stands as a major achievement in this school. Naturalism is generally understood as an extreme version of literary realism, one that stresses the more animalistic side of human nature and the powerful influence of environment and heredity in people's destinies. It's the kind of fiction that often includes poor, depraved, immoral, or otherwise low characters. So for a typical American girl raised Protestant in Kentucky, a Goncourt novel would be rather scandalous reading material. When we note how Chopin has Edna pick up a different kind of reading material in another section of the novel, we discover her taste for Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose literary imagination and essays could not be farther away from the often salacious impression of French novels. We should also note that reading Emerson puts Edna to sleep. Had Edna remained awake to read her Emerson, she might have come across a sentence like this one: "Life itself is a mixture of power and form, and will not bear the least excess of either. To finish the moment, to find the journey's end in every step of the road, to live the greatest number of hours, is wisdom."